Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Matongo wash processed Burundi from Good Life Coffee. There's the bag right there. And Good Life, based out of Helsinki, Finland, and they were a suggestion to us by Sukmu. So shout out to and thank you to Sukmu for the suggestion. This is Good Life's first ever appearance on this channel, as they're a coffee roaster I had zero familiarity with going into this review. And the backstory behind this review is pretty simple. I walked into a coffee shop, saw that they were carrying Good Life's coffees, recognized that they are on our suggestion recommendation list, so I decided to pick up a couple of their coffees. So we will see how they turned out, beginning with this one, as this right here is day 44. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind roast profile for this coffee. So going into this review, I only had familiarity with one other Finnish-based coffee roaster, which is of course Frukt. And Frukt, from what our previous experiences has been on the lighter side of things. And I've heard recently that they've been developing their coffees a little bit more than they used to. But given that it has been a bit since I've last had one of Frukt's coffees, that's still the best comparison I have for any Finnish-based coffee roaster. And this one was definitely more developed than what we've typically experienced from Frukt. So that's to say that it is probably a little bit more on the developed side of that medium light in terms of that profiles. It's not necessarily overly developed, but even then it's certainly not quite as light as what we've typically experienced from Frukt. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 19, first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and the development was immediately noticeable on this coffee as it was much more robust than initially expected, with a fair bit of texture within the coffee. Listed blackberry felt the most apt as there's a dark berry base to the coffee, but overall it was an okay first impression. And that's what's interesting about going into this coffee is, historically speaking, when it comes to a lot of the Nordic-based coffees, you'd fully expect them to maybe be on the lighter side of things. However, more recently I have heard from some people that are from the Nordic-based countries that a lot of the coffees that most people, the kind of everyday people, drink in those countries is on the slightly more developed side of things. It seems like a lot of the stuff that is exported or that is much more prominently acclaimed by people is on the lighter side of things, but that's why it was kind of interesting to experience this one being a little bit more developed than I might have expected for a Nordic-based coffee roaster. Day 22 opted for the Chemex, and it was a bit better than that initial experience as it was offering better definition with a slightly tropical tone, but darkness and tartness in line with the listed blackberry once again. Juicier as the cup has plenty of texture as it's still once again a pretty robust cup in general. Day 25 through the April brewer, and this is the best the coffee had been up to this point, as it was very reminiscent of fruit juice, with the listed blackberry once again being the most prominent aspect, especially in terms of the brightness. Better definition to the peachiness as well, as this time the coffee was notably more intense just in general. But to be honest, this coffee was never void of any sort of intensity, as right from the onset it was definitely experiencing a lot of more intense qualities, most notably in of course the fruit sense. Day 28 through the V60 with lower temperatures and just extraction in general, and the coffee remains pretty consistent as the most notable aspect remains the dark berry theme, with the base focusing mostly on the tartness to justify the listed blackberry, a bit less definition, a bit less of the additional fruit aspects as the coffee was a bit more direct this time around, just once again feeling a little bit more robust, a little bit more juicy, a little bit more body and texture, a little bit more traditionality in general. Day 31 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and it does continue to remain consistent with most of the defining aspects being the darker tart berries. Robust again, but the overall intensity feels relatively diluted to some of the previous days. And that's where we always come to that trade-off. Do we want the coffee to have maybe a little bit more of the less desirable qualities? But even then, right from the onset, I didn't necessarily feel that this coffee had too many of the less desirable coffees. When I'm saying that this coffee was just a little bit more developed, I think that kind of translated a lot more into the intensity in the body as opposed to any sort of unwanted characteristics, most notably thinking of any sort of smokiness, roastiness to it, because it doesn't really have that. You can just definitely feel that this coffee has a little bit more body, a little bit more robustness to it. So that's why on day 34, we decided to go back to the V60 with our standard recipe, and the coffee has just naturally increased in intensity with time, as there's continued focus on the darker fruit aspects of this one, simultaneously offering a strong, robust quality in tart brightness and in a lingering sense. So a lot of the notes pretty consistent. This coffee right from the onset was definitely skewing this way, and it continued to go in that direction, just with an overall increase in the intensity. And that's why on day 37, we opted for the Chemex with our standard recipe, and this was the best the coffee had been to this point, mostly because it continued to just increase the overall intensity. And while it was mostly skewing in a direction that wasn't necessarily within my own preferences, I do have to say that I just kind of appreciated the coffee for what it was. It was just a little bit more traditional of what you'd expect from something in this vein. There's focus on the dark berry tones once again in a greater sense, improved overall, but once again still robust, not really surprising. And on day 40, we opted for the Chemex one more time, and it continues to remain pretty consistent. Additional qualities include a honey attribute and a darker stone fruit reminiscent of plum. Quite robust still, with a nice caramelized sweetness. And I'm going to be completely honest, I am not entirely sure what roasting machine this coffee roaster uses, but for me it was pretty interesting to see just how much body, just how much texture, and just how much sweetness there was to this one, because it does make me wonder what machine they actually use. All right, let's go ahead and prep the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have a handful of level 4s, so we will go ahead and start with the body level 4. That is interesting to me. It is not that common and often that we actually have too many coffees, especially brewed with a Chemex, that have that much body to it. And truth be told, I was really surprised that this coffee had just as much texture as it did, but I really wanted to highlight that aspect of this one because it's much more full-bodied, and I think that's what I'm referencing when I'm discussing the robustness of this one, because it is quite textured. That's what's really surprising and interesting about this coffee just in general, especially going into it and expecting it to be a lighter profiled coffee. So that in itself is kind of interesting, a very interesting start to this tasting wheel. Cleanliness, level 4. Nothing to really take away from the overall cleanliness of this one. I mentioned that it's void of any of the really undesirable aspects, most notably strong development that hinders the overall experience of this coffee, but once again, you can feel that it just has that robustness to it. It has that little bit more heaviness to it. Finish, level 4, and that continued to skew for the majority of the time in that more tart sense. So I think there's a very big difference from what you typically experience from something like a Kenyan coffee that has that much more bright tartness to it, as opposed to something that was maybe a little bit more fruit sweet in terms of that tartness. So that's where that comes into play. Also an interesting caramelized aspect, which once again does make me wonder what roasting machine they were using. Sweetness, level 4. And I said right from the start that it is pretty sweet. It's definitely fruit sweet. As you can see from the tasting wheel, a lot of the aspects on this one do skew in that specific direction. So I could definitely see a fair bit of those. Florality, level 4. And as I'm thinking about that, I can definitely see it, especially given that it does have a fair bit of the darker floral aspects to it. I can't quite recall what the other tasting notes that they did have listed on here. I think blackberry and peach were two of them, but even in addition to that, I could definitely see a little bit more of those darker floral tones, especially given that this one does have a fair few of the darker fruit tones, and we'll go right to those, beginning with the berry fruit at that level 4. I could definitely see it once again, even if you want to go with maybe a black currant, but I think that this one is just a little bit more fruit sweet tart as opposed to just like tart. So that's why I really wanted to focus and kind of accentuate the blackberry note that they do have listed on here, because it's a little bit more reminiscent of a ripe blackberry. And blackberries, interestingly, are my favorite of the berries: raspberry, blackberry, blueberry, especially when they're done right and they're a little bit more sweet. So I think it's a little bit more on the sweeter side of that specific berry component. Stone fruit, level 4, and they have peach, but for me, honestly, it's a lot more darker of a fruit, most notably in the plum-like sense, though at times I was getting some subtle traces of peach aspects to it as well, so that's where that comes into play. A couple of level 3s, we will start with the acidity, not necessarily the brightest coffee, and I think that's what I continue to kind of focus on when it comes to both the profile of this coffee as well as the fruit intensity to it, because it isn't necessarily the overly bright kind of tartness to it, but a little bit more even in that regard. Caramel, level 3, and I mentioned that towards the end I was picking up a lot more of that caramelized sweetness to this one, so that would make a lot of sense. And yeah, since we discussed the body pretty early in this, as I'm looking at this tasting, I think that's it. I think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I kind of touched on that pretty early in this review, that it did turn out a little bit more developed than I might have expected, but I didn't necessarily have a good baseline of what to expect from this coffee roaster, because even with Frucht being the only finished coffee roaster we've had, I really am not entirely sure how it's going to turn out with some of these coffee roasters in general, especially when I've heard little to no feedback about them. I have never heard many people, well, I shouldn't say I've never heard, I've heard very few people talk about this coffee roaster in general. Honestly, I think the one suggestion that we've had about this coffee roaster is probably the only time I've heard any feedback about them. So once again, it's kind of like going blind into this review to figure out what you're going to get from it. And that's kind of essentially what happened. And I think it was just a little bit away from what I was necessarily expecting. Even then, there were a lot of positives to pick up from this one. And that's where I'm going to transition to the type of person I would suggest this coffee to. This one is a little bit more traditional, while still at the same time, I continue to focus on this, lacking any of the undesirable qualities, most specifically that very heavy roastiness, smokiness that can come from something that just does have a little bit more development. I think in that way it was presented in a much nicer sense, because it does have great intensity, it does have great body, it does have some really notable prominent fruit components to it, some really nice sweetness and some really nice clarity. So once again, I think it's maybe skewing a little bit more on the traditional side of things, but a much more modern approach to that because of just how much of the fruit components are present within this one. So I feel like if you do like a lot more body, a lot more texture, and then that's a pretty good place to start with this one. And then couple that with the very intense fruit components that can be on the darker side of things. If that's your coffee, then I feel like this one's a pretty good fit. But that's also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee or anything from Good Life, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it or them as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Matongo wash process Burundi from Good Life Coffee. Thank you for watching.